colleagues, and good afternoon on the East Coast. If you are coming to us from India, you should be in bed, where we will rebroadcast this in the coming days. But thanks for joining our session, High Tech Auto Tech, the Future of Cars. This is the third installment of our Driving Innovation webinar, brought to you by USIBC's Automotive Working Group. Now, there's perhaps not an industry where tech is more pervasive, more promising, and complex than it is in autos. So we are looking forward to hearing from our distinguished panel about the opportunities and challenges related to a host of exciting trends. Before I introduce our panel, a few housekeeping notes. First is that this session is being recorded for future distribution. And number two, if you have a question, you can put that directly into the chat box. We'll have a dedicated QA session a bit later on, but as questions come up, please feel free to type them in. I want to specifically welcome participants who are joining us as part of USIBC's West Coast Digital Summit. Yesterday, we heard from the Consul General of San Francisco, C.G. Prasad. We heard from ITU's Doreen Bodkin-Martin. We heard from India's Department of Telecom, the Secretary K. Rajamaran, who shared his vision of India's digital future. We heard from MAIDI. We heard from the director of MAIDI, Dr. Ajay Kumar Garg, on the potential of India's startup. And we heard from a couple startups who shared their experience of entrepreneurship, especially focused on rural digital development. So I want to also invite you in 1 hour to join the next conversation as part of West Coast Summit, which is the changing dynamics of digital finance. The changing dynamics of digital finance will be in 1 hour, and there'll be a separate link for that, but it will feature a partner from the Cohen Group, the vice president of Paytm, the founder of RSM India, the strategic payments and partnerships head at Microsoft, and the head of public policy at Sequoia Capital. So a great panel coming up. Now, on to our panel. It's my pleasure and privilege to give an introduction to our moderator and panelists. Our moderator today is Anand Shah, who is an advisor to our Automotive Working Group. Anand is the co-founder of Ola Electric and a senior advisor at the Asia Group. He is a trusted counselor to the world's most innovative companies navigating South Asia's dynamic business landscape. He is the founder of The Miri, a new venture that helps corporations align their core businesses with public good in critical international markets. Anand brings over 20 years of experience working across the private, public, and social sectors in India and around the world. Thank you so much, Anand, for moderating today's session. I'll hand it over to you in just a moment. The other panelists are Ram Ramasehashan. He is the geographic head of the Americas for Tata Elxsi. He's a member of Tata Group's North America leadership team and is responsible for Tata Elxsi's operations in the America region. He is responsible for building, leading, and directing strategy, revenue growth, and profitability across all industry sectors that Tata Elxsi focuses on, including transportation, broadcast, media and communications, healthcare, and life sciences and consumer products. Thanks so much, Ram, for joining us today. We will also have George Ivanov, who is the head of international policy at Waymo. Waymo is an autonomous driving technology company with a mission to make it safe and easy for people and things to get where they're going. He works on key autonomous driving policy and regulatory issues globally. Thanks so much, George. Appreciate you being here with us. And last but not least, we have Dan Byers, who is the Vice President for Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Energy Institute, GEI. With a focus on environmental and regulatory issues, Dan develops and implements strategies in support of the Institute's broader education and advocacy efforts. Dan brings nearly 2 decades of public policy experience to his work, directing the Institute in assessing the impact of existing and emerging federal laws and regulations on U.S. energy industry. Frequently speaks and writes on energy policy and environmental regulatory issues and has been published in a number of prominent outlets. Dan, really appreciate you making the time to be with us today. Your background is definitely going to be relevant to all that we're discussing. So, Anand, without further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Jasjeet, and it's wonderful to be here as part of the USIBC Summit and as well as with my fellow panelists that I'm helping moderate, Ram, George, and Dan. I'd love to take just a minute to outline how we discuss this today and leave it to those in the audience as well as each of you on the panel to feel free to ask questions to each other and to the panelists from the audience as we get towards that. You can do that in the chat box here on Microsoft Teams. You know, they say that the next 15 years in automotive is likely to have more innovation happen than the previous 100 years in automotive. And I think many of us see that happening right in front of our eyes, whether it is new vehicles that run on electricity, or it is the idea of ride hailing and whether we're getting rid of our second car or finding it easier to get from one place to the other, whether it is cars that we expect to update themselves overnight or be able to, you know, seamlessly move our location from our next meeting into the infotainment system or hear our Spotify playlist. And what we think of the sort of refresh rate of vehicles as well. For most of the last 65, 70 years, it takes 7 years for a new model to come out, and it's slightly better than the previous model. And all of this is in question today. And it's not just about the United States. It's happening all over the world. Norway is now selling more electric cars than they are non-electric vehicles, and perhaps will be the first country to go 100% electric. We see Waymo's vehicles, you know, slowly but surely getting on the road and delivering passengers without a safety driver, you know, into this idea of an autonomous future where we have perhaps less vehicles and better air and you know, less traffic and the ability to get from one place to the other while doing other things and be safer than we've ever been before. We see in South Asia, for example, a massive shift towards two-wheel and three-wheel electrification, the type of vehicles that people use the most and buy the most, but increasingly also in four-wheel and in other sectors like heavy-duty trucking, etc. And, you know, and with our climate bill here in the US, you know, more emphasis than ever on the energy transition and decarbonizing how we move. So I'd like to jump very quickly from that into our panelists, starting with Ram. Since Tata Elxsi is such a significant player in helping automotive OEMs around the world, you know, really build on their digital strategies, would love to leave it to you to tell us a bit more about what you're seeing, what you're anticipating, and what a vision for the future looks like when it comes to customers' vehicles, when it comes to OEMs and how they think about the future, and what it is that we should be expecting over the horizon, both as consumers, as businesses, and perhaps, you know, as users of mobility around the world.
Sure. First of all, thanks Jasjeet for the introduction, and USIBC for the opportunity. Anand, Dan, and George, look forward to this conversation and to learning from you gentlemen. So as you mentioned, Anand, in your preamble, right? I think these are very, very exciting times in the automotive industry, and you know, I'm not referring to the silicon shortage issue or the, you know, supply chain issues that we are grappling with. I'm sure these are some transient issues that will get addressed with time. But you know, to have this whole opportunity to work on three very unique technologies, right? Connected vehicle, electrification, and autonomous driving, each of which have the potential to transform the automotive industry as we have known them, like you said, in the last 100 years or so. Is in itself a very unique and very, very singular opportunity in our view, right? So we at Tata Elxsi are playing a very, very significant role as a technology services partner, working with both our OEM and Tier 1 and other ecosystem customers to help them with, you know, the pieces of technology that are needed to make each of these things happen. But I'll come to that in a minute. But to your question on what are some of the things that we are seeing in the industry today, I think it's safe to say that we are well on our way in terms of our journey to realize each of these three. Right, today almost about 80 to 85% of the vehicles have connectivity of some form of the other. So that is definitely a journey which is ongoing. There are several OEMs who have stated their goal to discontinue any further work on internal combustion engine, putting heavy bets on electrification. So that's a stated objective that we see across the board, from several OEMs. And of course, the kind of autonomous features that we are seeing getting added in cars almost every day is a clear indicator of us heading towards self-driven cars in future. We're certainly seeing a lot of new players, new services, and new regulations coming into play. I like to look at it in sort of three buckets. The first I would call as the value players. And these are, the OEMs, the tier ones, the silicon vendors, the connectivity providers, the telematics or the TSP providers, right? So the trend that we are seeing here is that each of them is playing an increasingly larger role today, right? I mean, gone are the days. Let me take a couple of examples. I mean, if it's a head unit manufacturer, we are not seeing the head unit manufacturer say that, here is my head unit or here is the box that I supply to the OEM, but they are increasingly playing a larger role in terms of delivering content, delivering value-added services, etc., to the OEM. Same thing can be said to the T-box manufacturer or the telematics box manufacturer, who are again not just confining to supply boxes to OEMs, but addressing the entire value chain, looking at newer monetization models and things like that. So that is one thing that we are seeing from the value players, who are obviously playing a bigger role than what they have traditionally been used to. The second segment is what I find to be very interesting, which I would call as the adjacent domains, right? I mean, I think the interesting trend that we are seeing with all these three areas which are getting developed is that the silos are all going away. What is increasingly relevant to a certain industry or important to a certain industry is also becoming more and more important and more relevant to to other industries as well, and to the overall ecosystem. Right, let me take a couple of examples again. I mean, insurance is going to have a completely different meaning when we get into self-driven cars, right? Of course, we have usage-based insurance and things like that, which have certainly made some very significant shifts in the last 5 years or so. But those are some industries that we are going to see increasingly getting integrated with the automotive industry. We also think that retail is going to have a completely different meaning when we get more and more closer to self-driven cars, because you are going to have, as the driver distraction becomes less and less, you're going to have the driver as a captive audience for you for almost 2 hours, right? Which is the average time that we all spend on the roads. Of course, I'm talking pre-COVID here. But so that's a captive audience that you have, and our captive market that you have. And I think all the retail companies are going to reinvent themselves to see how they can address this market segment. So that whole adjacent domains, those industries which traditionally have been detached from the automotive industry, are going to become increasingly integrated with the automotive industry, is the other trend that we see. And the last layer to me is the technology layer, things like cloud and big data and cybersecurity. I mean, all of this. 15 years ago, we wouldn't have spoken about all these technologies in the automotive industry, but they are all increasingly important by the day. So that's basically what we are seeing in terms of what each of these players are doing. So I think the ecosystem is getting more complex. It's getting more multidimensional, and it's also rapidly evolving. So the role that we see as a technology services company for ourselves is to see how we can enable each of these segments to achieve their goals. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'm happy to build on this as part of this conversation. So one of the platforms that we have developed is what we call as the connected vehicle platform. It's an award-winning product. In fact, it was nominated also in the awards automotive show recently. Was nominated in the best product category award. It's basically a at scale or a hyperscale cloud tool agnostic IoT platform which allows customers to deploy complete connected car offering. It's built in about 40 plus features that customers can build on. Another trend that we are seeing is, with the proliferation of all the sensors and ECUs in the car, there is just too much data that the driver is inundated with, right? Which is causing distraction. So we are also developing this AI-based UI UX platform, which basically provides the driver with information which is relevant to the context instead of just inundating them with too much of information while driving. So that's one. And then, of course, we have a very significant play in the autonomous driving space as well, where our middleware Autonomy is actually a platform that's used by OEMs to develop their entire autonomous driving strategy on top of. So that's the role that we see ourselves playing. And like I said, this whole ecosystem is rapidly evolving. It's getting more and more multidimensional with companies trying to do more and more. And so I think the need is today, in our view, to have an ecosystem integrator which can help customers stitch these things together. I'll pause there, and like I said, happy to build on it.
Thanks, Ram, and thanks for this incredible overview of how digitization is really creating opportunity and new things to happen, whether it is in the standard stack of value features, value players, or it's adjacent domains and what's possible when you have this vehicle that knows where it's going and what it's able to do and where it's been, and this technology layer. And then when you combine all of these, what that means, and especially these layers that begin to exist that none of us ever see, but really care about, without knowing we care about them, like cybersecurity, etc. But we'll come back, and if anyone has any questions, please make sure you put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them in about 15 minutes. I'm going to move over to Dan. Dan, one of the biggest topics today, obviously, is around the energy transition in vehicles, and I think for the most part, we hear about it in the news every day in the form of electric vehicles, and in the case of the U.S., it's tax credits coming and big shifts in OEMs that are saying they're never going to build a internal combustion engine again, and Elon Musk, complaining about something or the other online on whether this happens, and on the India side as well, we're seeing an immense amount of noise, including statements of India being a completely electric vehicle market at some point in the near future, and a lot of excitement among startups and OEMs alike, including Tata Alexi's sister company with Tata Motors. Would love to hear from you around, what's driving this? What does this energy transition mean? What does electrification look like? What are the forces at play? And what do you think that means for the auto industry at large, or whatever else you'd like to talk about?
Great. Well, thanks, Anand, and that's a great way to frame this. And I'll just start by saying, I'm not as familiar with the autonomous side. I work in energy and climate policy really across the economy, but there's no question there's an incredible amount of excitement regarding the transition to EVs. Both you and Ram mentioned the OEM announcements. We have a lot of policy levers in the form of tax credits, EV charging support, regulatory standards, et cetera. And so I think, maybe a couple of years ago, there was a little bit of an if on the question, and now it's really a when, and how does the transition proceed? My sense is, it's going to really happen all around the world. So I think a lot of these same factors would apply in India and elsewhere. And so as we look at it, one of the things when we talk, and this is not just transportation, but really any sector of the economy, we have a tendency, I think, because of what we've seen with other transitions, particularly smartphones and other internet digital-based transitions, that we think it's going to be sort of rapid and easy. And it's a little bit different when it comes to high capital intensive energy and these other sectors where you've got a lot of resource constraints, physics, value chain issues that you have to be dealt with. And so it's all going to happen. Don't mistake me for a pessimist on this, but I think there are a lot of factors that can potentially change that scale up period and really matter. Some of these are a little bit underappreciated. And if I could, I'd like to flag a few of them that we work on. One very quickly, and it's obvious one, and I don't think it's insurmountable at all, but this is just simply the grid demand constraints, right? We're going through an electricity grid transition where we're closing down our coal plants, eventually probably closing down natural gas, but looking to replace that with other cleaner resources. At the same time, we want to electrify transportation. It's going to add an awful lot of demand to that electric grid, and so and certainly in a country such as India, which is having a rapid scale up of its electricity capacity, that's something to factor in. It's not going to be insurmountable, but it is something to factor in. I think California is going to be a lead example there because they tend to be ahead of the rest of the country, both with respect to the uptake of EVs and the transition to a cleaner grid. So that's something to watch. But I think the big issue that's probably not fully appreciated is just simply the resource constraints and demand that's going to come when it comes to EVs and particularly the batteries. And we wrote a provocative piece this past summer asking the question, will lithium become the petroleum of the 21st century? Essentially recognizing that as our oil demand goes down, we're going to replace that with EV demand. And just to give you some numbers, current global lithium mining capacity is about 90,000 tons annually, very small. If you were to replace the entire U.S. light-duty fleet, that would require 2.5 million tons of lithium, so about 25-fold the current annual global capacity. And then you extrapolate that certainly to the rest of the world transitioning, and you can see that lithium demand is going to explode. International Energy Agency is expecting a 40-fold increase in lithium demand over the next 20 years. And this is just one component. We also have to deal with cobalt, graphite, nickel, copper that are used in much larger quantities in EVs, and a lot of these same resources are also in high demand for other clean energy transitions, a transmissions line for electricity grids, wind and solar, et cetera. So we're going to have to recognize that as we transition, maybe we're going to be drilling a lot less for oil, but we will be mining for the critical materials that are going to go into these cars. I think the good news is there's generally broad acknowledgement of this challenge, and it's generally been a bipartisan issue. So in the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden just signed into law, there's almost $8 billion to look at the battery manufacturing supply chain. I think it dovetails nicely with a lot of the constraints we're seeing just due to chips and other supply chain factors, where there's a recognition to try to onshore. And the other thing is, which I forgot to mention, is it's not just the mining, because in some cases, there will be mining activities and capacity in the United States or in U.S. allies, but the processing, refining, and even battery assembly is often still dominated by China. So we have to look across the entire value chain when we think about long-term energy security and meeting the supply that's going to come along with this demand. And so, like I said, I think there's a lot of reason for optimism that this will get solved, but it will maybe a little bit bumpy along the way. And it's a factor that we have to sort of come to terms with here as we look to accelerate the transition. I'll just give you one sort of quick anecdotal example, and that is in Arizona, North America's largest copper mine. It could supply up to 25% of U.S. North American copper demand. The permit was just rescinded for that due to anti-mining and activist concerns. And so there's just sort of tension here where we recognize that copper supply is going to be needed for EVs. EVs have 4 times the copper that a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle have. And we have to recognize that when we rescind those sorts of permits, we're going to be far more dependent on other countries, price will go up, et cetera, et cetera. So those are kind of, as we see this transition playing out, I think underappreciated factors, in addition to all the sort of consumer side factors that we know about in terms of just consumer acceptance, charging, range anxiety, affordability, all those kinds of things. So I just wanted to kind of share those thoughts into the discussion. I'll stop there.
Hey, Dan, thank you so much for that. Raises a lot of questions in my mind, and also seems to have raised a few questions for our audience as well. So we'll come back to them in the near term, but clearly there's a massive amount of change that's happening when it comes to energy, and there's a lot of implications of that. Clearly upstream on mining capabilities, what kinds of materials we're going to need, how much of it we're going to need. I'd love for you to touch as well on other ways that we get that, what industries are going to emerge because of it in the near future. But I'm going to quickly transition here to George. George, Waymo, perhaps the best known company by far in the world, talking about autonomy and the future, been working on it for many, many years and more miles traveled than any other company on the planet when it comes to these advanced vehicles. We've heard a lot about this utopia of, for me as a parent, when I don't need to drive my kids around to their things because the car will do it itself and come back and take me to my lunch meeting, and the future of being able to take taxis that pick you up and take you where you need to go and never need a vehicle again, and it'll be cheaper and cleaner than safer than it's ever been. I know that may or may not be where you guys are, but I want to give you a chance to chat a bit more about this incredible technology that we see as, perhaps the pinnacle of where automotive may be going in the near term, and comment on what that means for today and where it is now, and what kinds of implications it's going to have on topics that we may not even be thinking of, like data and policy around moving information and privacy, etc. So George, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to USIBC for having me on this panel with really a great set of panelists. I think you've touched on many key topics today, including the trends in electrification, trends in assisted driving, and as you noted on today, actually it is possible for people to take their families and children in fully autonomous vehicles, and it's in one place in the world. It's in Metro Phoenix, and that's what we'll talk about today. So Waymo's an autonomous driving technology whose mission is to make it safe and easy for both people and things to get where they're going. We began our journey initially known as the Self-Driving Car Project at Google in 2009, became a separate company in 2016 that's still a subsidiary of Alphabet. And our focus has been then, as it is now, to build level 4 fully autonomous driving technology that can transport people and goods to where they need to go without any human driving, no human involvement. So these are empty vehicles and empty cars. And what I mentioned a little bit earlier is really the first instance of that in the world, which is known as Waymo One. It's our commercial ride-hailing service that, after years of testing, launched formally with a publicly available app to the general public in October of 2020. And what I'd like to just play for all of you, if the technology complies, is a brief video just to show you what this looks like and the kinds of experience that people first have in the cars when they start taking rides.
That is nuts. It's pretty crazy. It's like there's a ghost at the steering wheel. I kind of feel like royalty being paraded around in this thing.
School zone.
Look at these guys. Looking over.
Are they?
No driver.
No!
What?
So Waymo thing is proven.
It's a pretty sharp turn. We made it pretty smoothly. Do I say thank you? We're here. We made it. And I didn't have to drive.
So that's just a very brief video of people's experiences in the Metro Phoenix area. And as you saw there, our technology, the Waymo Driver, which is a combination of hardware and software that can actually power a vehicle for fully autonomous driving, has taken quite some time to get there. It took 12 years of development across more than 10 US states, more than 20 million miles of public road driving and testing, and 20 billion miles simulated in our data centers to actually get to this point of something that within a 50 square mile territory today is serving hundreds of trips per week for members of the public. Overall, Waymo One has served more than 100,000 rides, and we look to expand that to many more. But the use case for the driver, particularly in improving safety and mobility, is really vast. Across the world today, we see more than 1.35 million people lose their lives every single year to traffic fatalities and more than 50 million injuries. So the global potential for improving road safety is substantial. We've expanded Waymo One recently to San Francisco with a trusted tester program where we still have an autonomous specialist behind the wheel of those vehicles, but ultimately look to grow this to that and to other use cases. Specifically, we're testing heavy-duty trucking and the Waymo driver in heavy-duty goods delivery between Arizona and Texas today, and look to really make those use cases fully autonomous, whether it's across passenger carriage or goods delivery. And so when we talk about this, we really think about it in the context of what it can do, but also the incremental steps needed to get there. And making that happen really is a major effort that expands beyond the US. When we purchase vehicles, we purchase them from our partners, including Jaguar Land Rover, owned by Tata Motors, with whom we've helped include their electrified Jaguar I-Pace vehicles into our fleet today that you see on roads in San Francisco. And that's been absolutely critical. Auto companies have more than 100 years of experience building cars and knowing how to do that well and doing it safely. And Waymo has the longest serving experience in the industry in building autonomous driving technology. It can really be matched and installed on those vehicles and operated into these fleets. And for us, that's a key way to start and to make sure that the public has brands that are known and trusted in terms of beginning to use this tech in small ways like they are in Arizona. But it also extends the development of this technology. And developing the software and hardware today is really a global exercise. While we're headquartered in Silicon Valley, we have development offices that extend to India, particularly in Hyderabad, where for several years we've partnered with some of the leading IT firms in India to ensure that we can work on data labeling and mapping development for our autonomous vehicles. And so that extends to everything from training of the algorithms for road behaviors and safe driving, all the way to building the extremely high fidelity maps that have down to a centimeter level of view that are needed for these vehicles to operate in their geography and the limited geographies that they're safely enabled for. And that really means that we are transferring data between India and the US on a regular basis. The contributions in India directly power the software releases that we have in the US today. And that's in large part thanks to the ongoing work between both the US and Indian governments, the ongoing trade dialogues that have transpired for many years, and really the platforms of favorable regulatory and legislative policies that enabled this and helped it happen. In the US, we've been working on policy measures relating to autonomous vehicles for nearly our entire existence. And the US became the first country in 2016 to issue guidance enabling fully autonomous vehicles for public roads across the country, which has since then been followed by more than 40 US states taking legislative action and executive measures to ensure that operation matches expectations under state laws. And we're seeing actions around the world of that kind. We now have activity at the United Nations, where both the US and India, along with many other regions such as the EU and other counterparts like Japan, are contributing to international autonomous vehicle regulations that we expect will guide the future of safety policy in this sector. And while that work's happening, we'd like to make sure that the ongoing existing measures that allow us to continue developing in India really continue to be enabled going forward by policy measures discussed today in India. One of those is the pending work on personal data protection legislation that's been underway for many years, and recent activity to move towards non-personal data being included as part of that. We have substantial interest in ensuring that those kinds of measures are really cabined to the specific sectors that they serve, and in an area like automotive are limited and respect the existing regulatory framework for data sharing as well as protecting company IP. And so as a part of that, we look forward to continuing the discussion on this with the panelists here today, and we're excited to be part of the ecosystem in India. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, George, and particularly for raising this question of, again, we're in this massive transition or transformation of the auto industry, and in your business, it's a global thing, right? Being able to make this happen in Arizona requires the ability for many different geographies to be able to contribute to it. And I guess one of the questions that also needs to be asked is, how do we ensure an enabling environment for making these technologies possible and all of the benefits of saving lives, or reducing pollution or reducing vehicles on the road, accrue to everybody. What does it take to ensure that continues to happen? We've got a couple of questions, and then we'll jump into some others, and I'll come back to the panelists to see if you've got questions for each other, time allowing. Number one, Dan, I'm going to point this at you, but anyone feel free to chime in about it. But there's a question around hydrogen and fuel cells and other types of electrification that may not be, high density lithium ion batteries, vanadium flow batteries in particular for trucks and ships. Do you care to comment a bit on the prospects of both of those and how policy or the world seems to be looking at them now?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the comment in the chat, and I couldn't agree more. In particular, apologize. My dog has anxiety when my wife leaves. Sorry about that noise. But yes, hydrogen is also very exciting. We don't want to necessarily put all of our eggs in the lithium-ion battery basket for the reasons I mentioned, and so there could be other battery chemistries that emerge, but also hydrogen, and especially in certain applications, long-haul trucking in particular, it makes a lot more sense to have a hydrogen battery. It doesn't take up as much weight in cargo capacity in the vehicle as well as in shipping. And so, in just incredible amount of investment. We've joked that we have a harder time finding members that aren't doing investment projects in hydrogen than are. It's just really picked up a lot over the last year. So fully agree with the commenter.
And just as a quick follow-on on that, Dan, so you expect that in this clean energy future that, it's not just about electric vehicles that are battery electric, but there is growing interest in the technologies that make fuel cells, other hydrogen applications, or other batteries possible.
Yeah, absolutely, and they are going to be a little further behind, certainly, and there's some policies even in the two large bills that are under consideration in Congress: hydrogen production tax credit, that sort of thing. There's a little bit of, as you often have, there's chicken and egg issues. So there's demand side signals, and the Biden administration has announced what they call the First Movers Coalition, which we think makes a lot of sense in terms of trying to find consumers for those that are going to be purchasing through the supply chain clean steel made from hydrogen or aluminum or shipped goods, that kind of thing. And so policy-wise, it's still really much at its infancy, I think, compared to traditional EVs, but it's, there's an awful lot of optimism for it.
Great, thank you. If any of you in the audience have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Ram, I'm going to just ping to you really quickly to follow up on George's comments. Given that you guys are a digital business helping OEMs do digital things across borders as well, what sorts of enabling capabilities do you think need to happen to continue to allow innovation to happen across borders? Number one, and two, similar to Waymo's ability to leverage India in developing a software stack that does this, where do you see continued shared interests in automotive and the automotive future between the United States and India?
I think, there are definitely several enabling technologies, Anand, obviously, that have to come together. But one of the things that we are increasingly focused on is on the V2X aspect, right? So while 5G is very, very promising, very simply put, it's only like a bigger and a larger pipe, right? It just gives you a higher bandwidth, it gives you lower latency, etc. So all of that is exciting. But, we got to keep in mind that when we are talking about implementing autonomous vehicles, we need to have a lot of the peer-to-peer network that needs to come together, right? Because, we are talking about signals not necessarily bouncing off a tower, but actually bouncing off from, maybe pedestrians, maybe, the other cars, the other infrastructure and things of that nature. So I think that is where a lot of work, in our opinion, needs to go. And those are some of the areas that we are working on. I think to George's point about Phoenix, there are some of those metropolis, there are some of those cities and states who have been more proactive about this, but unless we get more and more cities and states to take a more proactive measure here, in terms of setting up those infrastructure, investing on V2X, etc. It's still going to be a challenge to deploy this at scale. I'd certainly like to get George's views on this, but that's one of the things. And on the India thing, and I'm just also curious, and I want to get to see if George can chime in on this to see, what are some of the opportunities for implementing this in a market like India? Because I would tend to think that some of the things that you may need is to people to be driving on lanes, etc. And given that the traffic conditions in India could be a little chaotic, maybe they do not necessarily lend themselves very well to some of these. So just wanted to, get George, your thoughts as well, if I could.
George, over to you. You want to
Sure.
react to that?
Sure. Thanks, Ram. So just a couple of thoughts relating to that. So first of all, I think the point that connectivity still has some ways to go is one that's well taken, particularly in terms of connected roads and connected streetlights. And in fact, Waymo's technology started being developed in 2009 and it functions today without relying on that connectivity. So a place like Phoenix has no smart streetlights, no smart roadways, and the Waymo driver has to be able to operate like a human driver in the sense that it has everything on board it needs, including its training, with all the miles of driving that I mentioned, in order to be able to safely operate and get you to where you need to go. And so in the future where that connectivity might be available, there might be some additional information that might be useful for this kind of use case, but ultimately there's a lot of work that the governments have to do to enable that kind of connectivity. Where we do provide connectivity today is from LTE for rider support and ensuring we have customer support that's ready to speak with our customers at every turn in the vehicle. And that even though the vehicle does not have a driver, you always have somebody to connect with, whether you have a health reason to do so or the vehicle's been involved in a collision and somebody needs to address that directly. I think in terms of India and development, I think it's a fair point that the road driving environment is quite different from many other parts of the world. And it's specifically those differences that companies will need to test in the years ahead. The more challenging the driving environment in some ways, the more learning there is from a technical advancement perspective, which is why we typically put our technology in different kinds of challenging weather environments, road conditions, density levels, to ensure that we're training it beyond its current capabilities. So while today we might be driving at a 45 mile per hour maximum speed and a 50 square mile of Metro Phoenix, we're continuing to extend to both severe weather areas and testing technology and algorithms for that, testing to high temperature areas, testing higher density areas, and ultimately that kind of work, which will also translate to how do you comply with traffic laws and make sure that the driving behaviors are consistent with those of human drivers in the specific country, will ultimately play a role in how India rolls this out. But that's where, back to my prior point of international work on regulations beginning now, is an important one, because we will need to make sure that India is harmonized with other countries around the world. And there is a high risk in the space of fragmentation if that does not happen, and very different kind of pockets of regimes around autonomy that could lead to very different technical development. And we've been thankful that in the US that hasn't happened, thanks to the strong leadership from the very beginning and guidance from US DOT starting in 2016.
Thanks, George. Jasjit, I'm going to pass it back to you to close, but hopefully you'll also answer the one question that we didn't get to, which is, given all these incentives and transformations in EV in India, is there a chance that the American companies who have exited, General Motors and Ford, might find some new interest there? Or Dan, if you've got something to say, but back to you, Jasjit.
Thank you, Anand. That was excellent. I don't actually. On General Motors and Ford, that is a good question. Dan, did you have any thoughts on that one?
I'm not aware of plans in this short term, but obviously market size, it's clear. I think at some point there's got to be interest there.
Absolutely. I know that there's opportunities for partnership, and both companies in their exit have been involved in various kind of, I think it's honestly, the value chain is long and complex with autos, and maybe they find a different way to play in that space. But India has certainly proved to be challenging. There's no doubt about that. Now we're hearing Tesla is obviously entering that space, and we'll see how that goes. But I wanted to just close this conversation by thanking again our panel particularly our moderator, Anand Shah from the Asia Group, Ram from Tata Alexi, Dan Byers from the Chamber's Global Energy Institute, and George Ivanov from Waymo. Really wonderful. Thank you all. For our audience, if you have further questions or something we didn't get to, please feel free to send it my way and we can get your question answered. We can get it to the right person. Today we talked about a number of topics that I think were all very important: energy policy, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, of course, and the role of the regulatory environment in advancing or possibly hindering innovation in the automotive space, something that I know we're all very interested and attuned to. On that last point, USIBC's Automotive Working Group is currently defining its priorities for 2022, so we would welcome any member inputs into that process as we prioritize how we look at the year ahead. So with that, want to just wish everyone well. Be safe. Thank you all for joining this this webinar of the West Coast Summit, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.